Ladies and gentlemen, we will now move on to our second keynote titled How Africa Works and How Asia Works. Please join me in welcoming Ken Opalo, Associate Professor at the School of Foreign Service at the Georgetown University, and Joe Studwell, and Mr. Joe Studwell, Visiting Research Fellow at ODI. Mr. Ken Opalo, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you to the conference organizers for putting this together and for inviting me and giving me the chance to have a chat with Joe Studwell, who needs no introduction. I'm sure all of us read How Asia Works. And now we're about to get a treat on how Africa works. To start us off, Joe has a small presentation about the book. For those of you who may not have read it yet, I highly recommend it, as you'll see in our discussion. And then after that, he and I will have a brief chat, after which I'll open it up to Q&A. So without much ado, Joe, the floor is yours.
Very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to the organizers for asking me. Now, does that work? Oh no. Oh, it's come up down there, but it hasn't come up on the screen. What am I doing wrong? No? Here we go. All right. Am I in control now? Let me just see if I go forward. Oh, now I'm in control. Okay. So for those of you who know me from 25 years working on Asia, I'll just tell you the background to how I've come to write this book about Africa, how Africa works, following how Asia works. So it starts with a huge name drop because a big fan of how Asia works was Bill Gates. And I got invited to Seattle to talk to Bill Gates, and we talked for an hour or so about Asia. But at the end of the conversation, he said, actually, what I really want to know is what you think about Africa, which at the time I thought was a very stupid remark because I don't know anything. Well, I didn't know anything about Africa. And so I forgot about it. But about 6 months later, I got a couple of very strange invites, one from the Ethiopian government and one from the Rwandan government saying, would you come out and talk to us? And I said, well, this is very, very flattering, but it's completely pointless because I don't know anything about Africa. And they said, no, it doesn't matter. We just want to talk about Asian development policy. So I went, and those trips were what convinced me that there was some genuine, serious potential in Africa for development. In particular, I think Ethiopia. There they asked me to come, and I'd heard from a friend at the FAO there were very interesting things going on in agriculture in Ethiopia. So I offered them a deal because they weren't going to pay me. I said, well, I'll come so long as I can come for a week and you take me around the country and show me what you're doing. And in the course of a week in Ethiopia, I realized that there were very serious things going on. I was really impressed by the depth of knowledge of ministers, civil servants, regional leaders, just how much they knew about development in other countries. And that for me is hugely important because I always see development as an eminently doable thing once you recognize that it's about catch-up. All you're trying to do is what other people, other societies, economies have done before. And if you pay attention and if you apply yourselves, you can move very quickly because of the benefits of catch-up. You don't have to invent anything. You simply have to repeat processes that have played out elsewhere. It doesn't mean it's totally simple, of course, but it's eminently doable. So I then got into the research, started reading about Africa, read through the academic literature, read through the governance failure literature, which is enormous, explaining why Africa hasn't developed more quickly, read through the corruption literature, explaining why Africa hasn't developed more quickly, and the kleptocracy literature, and read through the civil strife and ethnic strife literature. But I got to the end of all of this, and I didn't really feel satisfied. I felt that I was I felt the reasoning seemed to me rather proximate, that I wasn't getting fundamental explanations of the African story. And it wasn't until I got back until the 1950s and 1960s that I found a couple of African authors, one a Burkina Faso historian called Joseph Kizerbo, who talked about demographics in Africa as a constraint. And that ended up being a major theme of this book. And to give you some context for what they were saying, which was essentially that Africa was not going to develop until it had more people because population density was too low. They made the observation that in 1960, average population density on the African continent was less than 10 people per square kilometer. Now, to give you context, that is the same as Europe in 1500. How much growth was there in Europe in 1500? There wasn't any. So why would we expect that there would be growth in Africa with population density that low? The absolute numbers in 1960 were that Africa had about 260 million people. Today it has 1.5 billion. So demographics then became a major theme of the book. The second big theme came from the case studies that I pursued of countries which had managed to get growth to a high level and sustain it over 15, 20, 25 years. And I looked at Mauritius and Botswana, Ethiopia and Rwanda. And one thing that came out of those case studies was that in each case, the governments had formed a cross-ethnic coalition. All right. Now, we all know that ethnic diversity is a big issue in Africa. It's actually largely a function of demographics because historically, 2,000-3,000 different ethnicities could coexist on this vast continent because there was very little, historians believe, conflict when different groups of often only 10,000, 20,000 people fell out with each other. One would simply move into a new area. And not have to fight. It's the diametric opposite, really, of European history, where Europe was more densely populated. And in Europe, we fought each other, and the winners imposed their values and their rule on the losers. That didn't happen in Africa. Vast numbers of different ethnic groups were able to continue to coexist because of low population density. Anyway, the second thing then that I saw in looking at these case studies was these cross-ethnic coalitions. So in Mauritius, after independence, the majority ethnic Indian population, which had been brought in to do the work that was previously done by slaves, after the end of the slave era, that population won the first election, but the leader of the Indian group reached out to the so-called Creole population, which is was the slave population originally from Madagascar and Mozambique, and said, no, let's form a government together. And that was the basis of Mauritian development. In Botswana, where they found vast troves of diamonds, there were 8 different Swana groups, and they were all subgroups of the same overarching ethnicity, but nonetheless they had different territories, different traditions, and so on and so forth. There, the national leader after independence, Seretse Khama, brought all 8 groups into a national development coalition. Previously, mineral rights had been vested in the particular ethnic group on whose land they occurred, but he said, no, we're going to make them national. Everybody signed off on this. And as a result, a developmental coalition took Botswana forward and had a higher growth rate than anywhere in Asia for an extended period. Then in Ethiopia, after the defeat of the Derg regime in 1991, Meles Zenawi came in and formed a cross-ethnic coalition there under the EPRDF. It was to some extent, a fake coalition, because behind the scenes, the Tigrayans, who were only 6% of the population, were manipulating many things and controlling many things. But still, in reality, if you looked at a cabinet and you looked at senior civil servants, they were a genuine ethnic mix from across Ethiopia. Again, it's a cross-ethnic coalition behind the enormous success that Ethiopia enjoyed until in 2020 the lid came off with that 2-year civil war that broke out, which was essentially a war against the Tigrayans, who had been to some extent manipulating the situation. Finally, Rwanda, after the 94 genocide, again, I think it's fair to say a somewhat fake coalition, because Kagame comes in, he's a Tutsi, he puts the Hutu into almost all of the cabinet positions, but Tutsi people are controlling almost everything that actually goes on. And as the years have passed, the Tutsi have just come into a more clear control of government, direct control of government. But nonetheless, it doesn't change the fact that every country that I looked at that has succeeded in rapid economic development in Africa so far has had a cross-ethnic coalition. So let's go back to the demographics, if this works. Yeah, here we go. So just to give you a sense, so the red line there for sub-Saharan Africa in 1961, that's 9.7 people per square kilometer. That's equivalent to Europe in 1500. And it rises this decade to about 50. Now, if you go across, you'll see that 50 was just where Southeast Asia was in 1960-61, when Southeast Asia began to take off. And East Asia was a bit higher at 70 and rises up to 150. So this is the point that I'm making, is that Africa was not, as I put it in the book, was not in the game previously. And what has happened with Africa going from 230 million people after the war to 1.5 billion today, 2.5 billion in 2050, 4 billion at the end of the century. What has happened with that demographic change, that demographic normalization, I would call it, is that Africa's finally in the developmental game. And it's a curiosity to me that the academic literature going back over the last 60 years has not really considered this aspect. It's all about you've failed in your governance or you've been too corrupt, but without giving the demographic context. If we look at some individual countries, half a dozen countries, you'll see that 5 of them, and I've just taken these randomly, fall between where Southeast Asia was in 1961 and where it was in 2023. I've kind of set this up to ask myself a question, because then, however, if you look at Nigeria, you'll see that Nigeria has gone up to 250 people per square kilometers. That is ahead of the roughly 150 in East Asia. So I'm saying that demographic density is important, but if demographic density is important, why isn't Nigeria growing at 10% a year? And that, I think, brings us to the point that I make in the book, and I say that a certain level of demographic density is necessary to get you in the game, but it doesn't guarantee that you win at that game. And of course, if we think about Nigeria, it's a classic country that was set up at independence to fail. Yeah, it's put together at the time of the First World War by the British. The name is dreamt up by the governor's wife. You've got 3 large ethnic groups, all fairly equal numbers, all vying for power. And sure enough, 6 or 7 years after independence, there's a major civil war. 1 million people are dead. And Nigeria has been working to get beyond that and become more politically stable ever since. And one solution that it's had is just to create ever more states. So there were 3 states, there are now 36 states. And the idea is that you can't have arguments between big kids if there aren't any big kids, if you follow the logic. So having 250 people per square kilometer doesn't guarantee that you're going to succeed. But the second part of the answer about Nigeria and that demographic density is that actually the news in the course of the last 25 years has been significantly better out of Nigeria if you compare it with pre-2000. So where would we expect the first evidence to come of better economic performance when you get more people? I would expect it to come from agriculture, because when population doubles just with a tiny bit of economic growth, demand for food triples. And this is the story of what's been happening in Africa. Well, if we look at Nigerian agricultural growth since 2000, it's averaged almost 6% a year. That's really not very bad at all. And we'll see some Asian comparisons in a minute. If we look at the development of Lagos as a major city hub, it's been extremely impressive. Whether you look at certain areas of manufacturing, whether you look at film, whether you look at fashion, there's a lot going on. Lagos is now going on for almost a quarter of the Nigerian economy. So I would argue that more people has translated into changed economic performance in Nigeria. Okay, so this just shows you, here we have on the blue line, population, instead of per square kilometre, population per hectare of cropland, going from 2 to 5 people since 1970. And what has Africa done so far to feed its population? Partly, in the last 20 years, there's finally been some increase in yields in agriculture, but the area under crops has increased massively. It's gone from 140 to 270 million hectares. And this is a reminder of the fact that Africa is super land abundant. People hear that population is going to be 2.5 billion in 2050 and start to panic, but there's no reason to panic. According to the World Bank, Africa has perhaps half of all the remaining uncultivated, cultivable land in the world. And then we look at agricultural growth rates. So just take a minute to reflect on the fact that China, Vietnam, and Thailand are near the bottom. This is agricultural growth rates since 2000. And it's not in most cases because these countries are particularly well managed that the agricultural growth rates are that high, or because the governments care very much about farmers. This is driven by demand, and it's the demand that comes from rising populations and higher shares of processed food, which require larger raw inputs. So, Ethiopia will be one that has taken agriculture very seriously, but Nigeria hasn't taken agriculture terribly seriously, and it's still managed to do almost 6%. Mozambique, doesn't take agriculture remotely seriously, in my view, but its performance based on those numbers is excellent. And then I put in Mali as well at 8%. I've mislabeled this UNCTAD. These are actually FAO data. But Mali at 8%, and Burkina Faso is similar as well. And why would that be? Well, my suggestion is that it's consistent with what we saw in East Asia, that the countries with the sparsest cultivable land are the ones which improve their agriculture fastest. So if those numbers are right, I mean, Mali, for instance, produces rice, and the numbers for rice production are extraordinary. If the FAO numbers are correct, Mali's performance in rice since 1970 is as good as Vietnam. And if it is correct, I think the reason is because land is relatively scarce, and so a lot of care is taken of it. Okay, so the agricultural story off the back, I would say, of this population density story is really quite good. This is the place where is the primary locus of good news in Africa at the moment. And of course, it's not just in the farming. It's when you go downstream from the farming, go to any country in Africa and look at the processing operation, the milling, the production of processed foods, go into any shops in Africa and look what share of processed foods are in shops now and that are produced domestically. And the agriculture is having a major effect. One one thing that we have to hope is that stronger agricultural performance is going to produce less variation in overall growth in Africa. A huge problem in Africa to date has been very, very up and down growth. If you look at Asia, one of the first lessons that you should learn is that countries that grew very fast in Asia managed their growth rates. They made sure they found out what kind of growth rate they could do, and they made very, very serious efforts to maintain it. And the fundamental reason for that is the signaling that it gives to the private sector. If you have a 5% or an 8% growth rate and it's the same every year, it tells the private sector that you can risk your capital, you can invest, and the economy will stay this way long enough for you to get a return. If growth bounces around, as it has historically in Africa, largely because of mineral dependency and hydrocarbon dependency, then you will not get the domestic private sector to invest. So if you've read how Asia works, you'll know that the construct I present is that we focus on agriculture first because that's what employs the vast majority of the population in a poor country. And then you look to manufacturing because manufacturing takes people out of the rural economy. Manufacturing upskills people in a way where they learn on the factory floor. It doesn't have the problem that value-added services tend to have, where you have to educate people before you can provide the services and do the work. So it's terribly important. And as we can see here, the story of manufacturing in Africa is pretty disastrous. It's less than 10% of the economy. Now, in developing East Asia, it's coming down, but it's coming down there largely because services are growing as a share of the economy, not because there's an absolute decline in manufacturing output. So can manufacturing work in Africa? And my only solution to this was to go and visit the manufacturing enclaves that exist in Lesotho, in Madagascar, here in Morocco, and ask myself, does this look like it can expand, that it works, that it can expand to other countries? And the answer I came away with is I absolutely do not see what the problem is. And again, it's demographics fundamentally, because at the end of the Second World War, when strangely the world was quite optimistic about African development, at the end of the Second World War, average labor rates in Africa were twice what they were in Asia. And that was a function of there being so few people in Africa. Now we're at a point where in different African countries, factory wage rates are between half and 1/10 of what they are in China. So China's about $600 to $700 at the moment, and you go from Ethiopia or Madagascar, where labor rates are 1/10, to places like Kenya, where they're closer to a half. But nonetheless, the labor rates are competitive in Africa in a way that they never have been before. And of course, they're competitive in relative terms, as has to be the case. There are still problems. India's bidding for India, which has always itself neglected manufacturing, is bidding for more manufacturing. You've got some countries in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, that are looking for more manufacturing. But my argument is that if you're serious about manufacturing in the way that the Ethiopians have been serious about manufacturing, and you get yourself set up properly, you are going to be able to bring people in to produce here. I don't see any fundamental problem, nor do I see a problem from AI and robots, which gets thrown out from time to time, for two reasons. One is that whenever there's discussion about robots doing manufacturing in sectors like garments, there's no discussion of cost. Robots cost quite a lot of money in a garmenting operation. A fairly basic robot costs $100,000, and you've got to pay for it up front. Whereas human beings in Madagascar, who are very dexterous, can be hired for $60 a month, and you just pay them month by month. And when you don't have the demand, you fire them. Yeah. So for that reason, and also for that reason, for the reasons of cost and the reasons of flexibility, I just don't think that it's going to be the case that there won't be a role for manufacturing in Africa. And the other thing that people forget is when they think about manufacturing in Africa, they think about exporting to Europe or the US or whatever. I don't think a lot of African manufacturing is going to be like that. I think that on a continent into which you can fit China, the US, and Europe, I think that on a continent of that size, with 4 billion people at the end of the century, an awful lot of manufacturing is going to be done for African customers in other African countries. So the biggest problem, I conclude in the book, with manufacturing is that governments are still failing to take it seriously. And if they don't take it seriously, and they rely on low value-added service activities like hawking goods in the road, they're going to put themselves in a situation where civil unrest is a serious problem, because that sector is not going to generate meaningful jobs. So yeah, and this is the last one. I think that, what we're waiting for, one of the things that we're waiting for in Africa now is a meaningful increase in the investment rate. If we think back to the 1970s in East Asia, that was when the investment rate kicked up above 25% of GDP. If we think back to India here, South Asia, but India is the biggest part of it, it's after the reforms of 1991, the investment rate kicks up above 25% of GDP, and that's what we're waiting for sub-Saharan Africa. I hope it will happen, and I think that then we'll start to get into a virtuous circle and move forward. And just a last thing to say on demographics and the growth of cities in Africa. If you go back to 1900, very, very few people lived in cities in Africa, largely because contagious disease meant that your risk of death was even greater than living in the countryside. So the two biggest cities in Africa in 1900 were Dar and Lagos, and both had 20,000 people. All right, we are now in a very, very different place as a result of demographic change, and of course, finally the control of the disease burden that kept African populations so low for centuries and centuries, and that is very positive and means that we're going to have big cities from which the fiscal possibilities are far greater than they've ever been before. And one thing that African governments desperately need, because they are all on average getting only 10 to 15% of GDP in tax take, in total fiscal income, they need more fiscal revenue. But again, I would suggest that demographic change is going to strengthen African governments by putting more money in their pockets. I'll stop there.
Okay, I get to grill you. So as I said at the beginning, I really liked the book for two main reasons. One is that I think the narratives we tell ourselves about how the world works are very, very important. And I think for too long, as Joe was mentioning at the beginning of his talk, we've come up with so many sort of symptoms as the fundamental causes of underdevelopment in Africa. And rarely do we go for sort of the real causes that actually differentiate the region from other places that have done well. So, if you think of governance challenges, corruption, weak state capacity, right? Those are common across the board, right? When East Asia started developing, they were building their state capabilities as they were going. There's still a lot of corruption in East Asia, right? They were corrupt as they were growing. So those are not, constraints that we should think of as insurmountable in the African context. And so it's really good that we have works like this that sort of force us to step back and look at the bigger picture and think comparatively about what is really holding African countries or other developing countries back. And then the other reason is that I think the narratives, and Joe talks about the power of demonstration effect in the book. The idea that it's easy to learn from comparable cases that have done well. So going and sort of getting the details of how Botswana did it, Mauritius did it, Rwanda did it, Ethiopia did it, I think is very useful for policymakers. Because too often when you talk about, say, Ethiopia and Rwanda as good examples, right, people quickly run to the autocracy bit and say, all you need is a strong man, right? But, Mobutu was a strong man, right? There was something different about these sort of autocratic systems, if you will, that made them tick and make good policy and stick to the policy. So the narratives that sort of are behind the cases reveal the actual sort of mechanisms that produce the outcomes that we like to see. So it's not the autocracy; it's the state capacity and systems and so on and so forth. And so with that, Joe, the first question I have is on development coalitions, which we've mentioned in passing multiple times today. So on the one hand, yes, it's great that you've identified this sort of important core part whereby elites can make or break state trajectories. If you have focused elites who are sort of committed to development, then you get a chance to get on the path to growth. But I'm curious, if you could tell us a little bit about knowledge production for the elites, right? So, in the book, I was sort of waiting to see stories about, where did Meles learn, about what to do? Did he have a think tank? What made Siratsakama different as an individual? Was there a team of thinkers behind him? Because, I think in the East Asian cases, right, there was always a team of thinkers that not only disciplined elite action, but also propagated the same ideas throughout the system. So, what are your thoughts on knowledge production and contextual learning as part of the development coalition that is so vital for growth?
Thanks. They had exactly what was there in Asia. In each of those 4 cases in Africa, they had small groups of people setting priorities and getting them actioned. And I think that's just the nature of the game. But you've got to have leadership at the top. And the great thing about a leadership coalition, right, is that then in Mauritius, for instance, they still had elections. So then government would change. But having had a leadership election, it was usually the case that policies would remain intact and would continue to be pursued. So they'd been agreed, essentially by both racial sides of the divide in Mauritius. And that worked very well because, as I heard raised a couple of times already today, if you get policy right in an African country that's a democracy, how do you keep the policy being followed long enough for it to have some meaningful impact? Well, if you have a developmental coalition and you have a change of government, it's more likely that policy will remain intact. But each of those countries had small groups of people, and that's one of the sort of great things about economic development is you don't need huge numbers of people, right, at the top in terms of your research group. I mean, China with 1.4 billion people has a National Development and Reform Commission with 170 employees. All of the macro planning for the Chinese economy is done by the macro department. It has 100 people. So I think, you get things right at the very top, and then, small groups of people can be very effective.
And would you say that you can do it despite being small, or do you almost have to be small to maintain the discipline and cohesion, to maintain the discipline? And this kind of gets to the question of, the messiness of the democratic process in many African countries where, in the name of inclusion, right, such teams could quickly balloon. Uganda has, hundreds of presidential advisors, mostly because of, electoral sort of patronage purposes.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, too much governance in Africa grows out of the aristocratic nature of many governments, right? And so if you're an aristocrat, you've got to have lots of people kind of running around your court. That's not the way that good development works. Good development is effective when it gets quite flat. So I was amazed. I was told by the guy who was the former governor of the central bank in Botswana, telling me about how Seretse Khama's vice president used to do like weekly meetings with the planning staff, and they'd do them at home, and they'd just sit on the floor and talk about the best way to build roads. And they just go through each week. There was some fantastically practical topic that was confronted. And that ideally is what you want, and you can't afford to have too much sort of noise, and you don't, and to have people who don't have real jobs.
Yeah. And so, final question on this sort of theme. It's always a tension when we talk about, the reality of multi-party politics on the continent and the demands of coalition building for development, right? I know it's hard to imagine a way forward, right? Besides saying that we need developmental coalitions. Do you have thoughts about how you do that in a democratic context? Of building development coalitions, like where would you anchor the stability that these development coalitions provide? And I know Mauritius was a case where perhaps it was easier. The island states that ring the continent, they tend to do better at coalition building for the long haul. But on the continent where there's, territorial concentration of ethnic groups, there's a lot more balancing that needs to happen. How can we take the Mauritius model onto the mainland of developmental coalitions in the context of electoral competition?
I think it's hard, but it can be done. I mean, it was done obviously in Botswana. I think that Ethiopia, in terms of a functioning government, was a genuine cross-ethnic coalition. That has actually, since the Civil War, that's gone on under Abiy. So the Civil War was against Tigray, but there are Tigrayans in Abiy's cabinet today. So that tradition is there, and I think you make the commitment. You accept that it's not easy, and you work to make it work, because it's for me, it's the essential precondition of having a genuinely developmental government.
Thank you. So moving on to a question that will be of interest to the researchers in the room on agricultural development. So in the book, you keep coming back to the question of smallholder agriculture, sort of like, the initial ticket to reduce rural poverty, but also get populations on the ladder towards manufacturing and growth in incomes. Given the context of Africa, where in some cases you have very large farm sizes, South Africa, bits of Kenya, but in most of the region, right, smallholder agriculture is the norm. It's terribly inefficient. and so on and so forth. Do you have a sense of what's the optimal farm size? And from a dynamic sense, how should we see this evolving? Will market forces give us the optimal farm size moving forward, or should there be policy intervention to create an quote-unquote optimal farm size that will produce the growth and also reduce rural poverty? Because, I think you make a strong case for why you don't want to lock in inequality as part of the growth process. And one way of doing that is by giving rural households a source of income as part of the growth process.
I don't think it matters what optimum farm size is, because almost no African governments are going to make an effort to make that happen. I think we can see very clearly what is happening. I mean, it's really only Ethiopia and Rwanda that have a commitment to fairly sort of equally sized smallholdings. Elsewhere, we can see what's happening. Population is rising. Population doubles, and food demand triples. That's basically now your rule of thumb in Africa. That means that in peri-urban areas, agriculture is changing radically. I mean, you can find places, even in somewhere like Tanzania, you can find places where yields in peri-urban areas are getting up to Asian levels, which is unthinkable in Africa 15, 20 years ago. And what's happening there is that, what these guys I describe as the urban kulaks, are basically city people are buying or leasing land and farming 5, 10, 15, 20 hectares. That is displacing some smallholders. They do at least get sort of cash for their land. It's not ideal, but the fact is it's what is happening, and we just have to live with it, and it's going to produce greater inequality in Africa than I think is optimal for development. However, when you get into the deep countryside, smallholders have still got their land. That's not under pressure, and the places where land is being chopped up into little pieces because there isn't enough land are still relatively localized in Africa. So Ethiopian highlands around the Great Lakes. In overall, Africa remains a land surplus continent. So the kind of summary of my view is that the general agriculture story is the best news in Africa at the moment. Is the detail what I would like? No, it isn't. But unless you have developmental governments that are thinking about all this stuff, that's not going to happen.
And then finally, before I open it up to Q&A, on labor. So you're fairly optimistic about the prospects of labor-intensive growth despite automation, which I think may be a source of hope for those of us who are freaking out about this. And then, in the book, you talk about education and how, especially if you're doing manufacturing, right, you don't need a top-shelf education system to get going. You can grow and then skill up as you go. So what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts about the education systems across Africa, or education attainment so far, and how you see that evolving given the demographic pressures? Something like 92% of the school-age growth in school-age population across the world will be African over the next 50 years, which is a massive share of the future global labor force. So what are your thoughts about education and human capital development?
Yeah, so I thought about this quite a bit for the book. If you look very short term, if you go and look at some African country with a microscope, look at its education system, there's lots of things you can complain about. You can say the quality of education, the standard of kids who've been educated to a certain level and should be able to do certain things and can't do them. All right. I think that the bigger picture is more important. And the bigger picture is that in 1960, Africa was a continent with 16% literacy and 5% female literacy. And there was a World Bank report in the 80s that said that nowhere in the world has developed a public education system as fast as Africa has. And I think that actually Africa should, African countries should get some credit for that. Of course, it becomes more difficult as you go on, because then you're trying to educate more people to a higher level and it's more expensive to do. But in general, if African governments had not done as well as they did with education, the demographic gain would not have been worth much, right? Because if you can't read and write and you're innumerate, you can't really enter the modern economy. You're not a lot of good in a factory. You're not even that much good on a farm, if you've got a sort of fertilizer packet that you need to read. So I think I prefer to take a sort of a long-term view and feel quite good about how Africa has done with education.
All right, thank you. I'll open it up to Q&A. We'll take 3, maybe 4 questions in the first round. So 1, 2 in the back with the white shirt, 3, 4.
Thank you, Joe. My name is Abhas Chan from the World Bank. So one question and one very quick comment. So the comment is that you mentioned cities in passing, and there was an important UN Habitat report that came out about a month ago, which says that 55% of Africa's urban population already lives in secondary cities. And in the next 20, 30 years, the most explosive growth is going to happen not in Lagos or Nairobi, but in these secondary cities like Kisumu and others. And these are precisely the cities which have the least capacity to manage this kind of explosive urbanization. That's point number 1. But also you're seeing this big trend on economic corridors, like Lobito is right now in the news. If you don't fix the secondary cities along the corridors, the jobs are not going to come. So I think that was my comment, that we really need to focus on this from a policy perspective. My question is on the Africa Free Trade Agreement, and you've talked about it and you've written it in your book about, it's probably the lowest hanging fruit in terms of, positive things that you could do to jumpstart growth, and yet it's not happening. How do you compare the African Union to ASEAN? I realize, it's a very different context. ASEAN is much smaller, but yet, despite a lot of diversity, because you have Myanmar and Singapore in the same organization in ASEAN, they've managed to be remarkably effective. Why do you think the African Union hasn't been similarly successful?
Hi, Ben Hyman from the Africa Jobs Fund. Thank you for the talk. I think in how Asia works and how Africa works, the smallholder farmer and the higher productivity levels they achieve is pretty core to the thesis. But you also mentioned that in peri-urban areas, a lot of this land is owned by, government officials or teachers or whoever else owning 10, 20 hectares. So are these people kind of as productive, if not more productive, on their farms? And then more generally, how confident are you that smallholder farmers are always more productive, regardless of crop type, of market dynamics, of climate, of all these other factors? And kind of what's the evidence or the basis on that?
Thank you. Joseph Nyagari, Gatsby, Africa. You made a very important point about 50% of the arable potential undeveloped and cultivated land being in Africa, which is great. But there is also an aspect of real estate boom, which seems to be targeting the same arable land. And then there's also an aspect of uncontrolled subdivision, which renders some of the land really difficult to do commercial agricultural projects. So is there room for innovative policies, land policies, to protect this? Because if it's not protected, then it could not necessarily translate into value.
Hi, Lauren Gilbert in development. You mentioned briefly civil strife, and in 1961, Asia had these deep, violent civil wars that have largely resolved. Now, Americans go on vacation to Vietnam. How do you see Africa resolve it? Those kinds of ethnic conflicts in Africa have been less well resolved. How do you see Africa resolving those in the future? Do you think it is economic growth will help resolve those, or the other way around, that you need to resolve civil conflict first in order to get to economic growth?
Okay, so back to the first one. I was always very unimpressed by ASEAN, to be honest, as an organization. Really only operates on the basis of consensus, never really did very much. Sort of economic agreements for years and years didn't get enforced. So I wouldn't say the AU is any worse than ASEAN. From my perspective, I'd be fearful that the AU might be as weak as ASEAN going forward, and I hope that it won't be. Yeah, I don't have a good answer on that, other than that I think for the continent, the development of that institution is very important. And then on cities, I couldn't agree more with you. There's a lot of things that don't get considered as part of government policy or strategy or needs in African countries. And the management of cities and the management of corridors along which growth is going, just critically important things, exactly the sort of things that do get considered once you have any kind of sort of planning and research structure set up. China, for instance, everything was planned down almost to the person in terms of who was going to go and live where and how they were going to avoid having overcrowding in large cities. So I hope that governments do get more engaged on this, and obviously your institution is the one that falls to. Okay. So, talking about productivity of what I call these new sort of urban kulaks in agriculture, I think that in general, they are reasonably productive. But I would imagine that you can, if you've got a smaller holding than say 20 hectares, if you've got half a hectare and a family and a supply of essentially free labor, it's always theoretically possible to get a higher yield. And that is what the story has always been with smallholder farming. It's really about the labor component, because particularly if you've got 4 or 5 kids and you're tapping rubber or you're growing maize, whatever you're doing, you can get more out of the land than anyone farming at greater scale, because you can literally go around and sort of do the fertilizer plant by plant and do the irrigation plant by plant. And then, the question was about whether smallholders are always more productive. No, there's some variation between crops, but there's a huge literature. And I would say the consensus from that huge literature is that what's often referred to as the inverse relationship between size and yield in agriculture holds, but inevitably you get a lot of different outcomes, not least because since the smallholding yields are so dependent on the labor input, the variation in what people do is a critical consideration. But the one thing that I'd add there in terms of what all the stuff that I've written about smallholder agriculture is that for me, smallholder agriculture, so if it can produce a better yield, that's great, but it's not ultimately the most important thing. The great thing about smallholder agriculture in Asia, particularly in the land reform countries, is that you had a very equal distribution of income as a result of it. And this led to a very uniform pattern of consumption. And people, smallholder farmers, cannot afford to buy imported cars. They can't afford to send their kids overseas for education. What smallholder farmers buy is local consumer goods, local services. And so it has this very positive early multiplier effect on the local economy. Okay, land policies to protect. Well, I don't. I'm not quite sure what my answer is there. I mean, obviously, it is possible to have policies to protect agricultural land, and that's just going to vary country by country. But my observation is that in most African countries, governments don't get terribly involved in agriculture beyond, I mean, they like to provide a bit of subsidized fertilizer from time to time, but they're not embedded in the rural economy. And that's a constant problem. On ethnic conflict, so it was ethnic conflict. Will economic growth solve the problem? Well, that's what Meles Zenawi thought, and it didn't turn out very well. Economic growth, can take the edge off perhaps, but it doesn't address fundamental ethnic difference. I think that ethnic conflict is resolved politically. And I think that's consistent with what I found researching this book about countries that have done best in Africa are ones that have formed cross-ethnic coalitions. So if you deal with that problem at the outset and you put that stuff aside and you say, actually, what we're focused on is development, not on whether we're from this group or this group, that's the way forward.
Yeah, and I should add that on the question of ethnic identity, it's interesting if you look at Afrobarometer data, I think, which speaks to your point about education attainment, the proportion of respondents who identify their ethnic identity as their primary identity has been on a steady decline since the beginning of the surveys in the late 90s. So that, across the board, ethnicity is decreasing in its sort of hold on people. And most people now say both national and ethnic identity are equally important for them. And the share of those who identify only with the national identity is actually steadily going up as well. And some of this is because of urbanization, as you'd expect.
And also just generational change, right?
Yes.
I mean, I completely agree with Ken on this point. I mean, when there were the so-called Gen Z riots, whatever you call them, in Kenya, and it was reported there that this was not ethnically defined. And I thought, oh, that's great. First. And there have been cases in other countries. I mean, there have been cases in West Africa as well. So finally we're beginning to see non-ethnic rioting.
Yes, so we have 2 minutes. I'll give 2 more questions. So Ori in the back, and the hand at the back there.
Thank you. Hi, Joe. I'm Ora Ogunbi from The Economist. You said you don't really buy into the AI and robots risk, especially on the labor intensity question, but I wanted to challenge you a bit on that. We published a piece with Aliko Dangote just over a week ago, and we went to see his refinery, and it is noticeably quite thin on people. And we pulled him up on it, and he was like, look, it's fully automated. He said the same thing about his cement plant, and it's efficient that way. It is accurate that way. You don't have room for human error. And in the long term, it is cost efficient. So even the argument that you made that, well, robots are expensive, I think if people are doing the math with longer term projections, it's actually cheaper to have really efficient robots. And so my question to you is, if Africa's manufacturing sector continues to develop along those kinds of models where efficiency, ultimately, for the sake of your margins, is prioritized over labor intensity, do you still see that Asia-style takeoff coming from growing manufacturing sectors if it looks like that? I want to share your optimism, but I just thought I'd ask that.
Thank you very much, Nicholas Piringer from Harvard University. I wanted to take us back to cities and especially tier 2 ones. Your thesis in the book, of course, revolves centrally around these inner circles development coalitions that produce, high quality planning at a national scale. I wonder, how do we get these coalitions to care about these tier 2 cities in a way that unlocks their growth potential and helps cities become the growth driver that they're currently not in sub-Saharan Africa? Is there something we can learn from the Asian context? Do we have to reinvent the playbook? Very curious on the political economy end there.
Yeah, so I'll allow the two questions that were over here. One, and then two. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Mamo Meretu, and I happen to be from Ethiopia, and I met Joe before. I just want to follow up on his central thesis, which is the need for cross-ethnic development coalition, and to what extent should that be scrutinized further? It seems to me, for example, taking the case of Ethiopia, it's true that, under Mallas, there was a sustained economic growth in Ethiopia. There was significant infrastructure build up, and there's no denying about that fact. And I wonder, to what extent that is because of the existence of cross-ethnic development coalition. Isn't it just because the leadership at that time, traditionally, leadership in Ethiopia, not just unique to Mallas, is obsessed with development. So that obsession with development is a key driver for economic growth in Ethiopia. In fact, one could argue the ethnicity issue has been given an unusual, and I would also argue unnecessary political silence during Mallas era. So if what I'm arguing, which is the obsession with development is a key driver for economic growth, then truly what will bring about development essentially is leadership. And essentially the process of economic development is a political process. I feel like you've given ethnicity an emphasis that it doesn't deserve. And I would argue in Ethiopia, the ethnicity aspect of it has been unnecessarily politicized. So, what would be your response to that? Thank you so much.
Where was this? Yeah, you had your hand up.
This is pretty down in the kind of stakes, that other people have asked about. But you mentioned in passing about data quality. You said if we trust the FAO numbers, and this is true. So I guess a question is, as a sort of curious outsider observing Africa, maybe actually Ken can speak perhaps more to this, is what do we think about the capacity of African statistical systems to generate and share accurate data, and the extent to which that matters for the kind of theorization that we have seen today? Thank you.
I think on the Ethiopia question, maybe you can tell us your process within the book. The ethnicity, was it because of the more institutionalized approach to ethnic balancing in Ethiopia that, this came to the fore, or is it something that was apparent even in the other contexts where perhaps, say a Kenya where there is an acceptance of ethnic balancing, but it's done as informally as possible. It's not institutionalized in the manner of ethnic states, which sort of raises the political salience of ethnicity.
Thanks. Let's start with Mamo's question on Ethiopia then. So I don't think the ethnic stuff is a diversion in Ethiopia, but I do agree that a developmental obsession is what you want. What Meles used to call hegemony of development. But I remember from that first week I was in Ethiopia, I was conscious of the fact that money for certain things was being spread out around the country in a way that didn't seem logical to me. And when I asked about it, it was being spread out for federal reasons, which were pretty much they are aligned, closely aligned with ethnic questions. So I think that it was always there. And Ethiopia could never hide the fact that 6% of the population had the ultimate had ultimate control over the rest of the country, because it was a kind of a not very well kept secret that Tigrayans controlled the state security and the military and so on and so forth. So I think it was there in a very real sense. I mean, I also think, as I write in the book, that Ethiopia is a very strange country in the sense that it is an empire, historically an empire, in which 4 different ethnic groups like to think of themselves as the sort of senior people. The Oromo because there are more of them, the Amhara because they were the people who were always on side with the emperors, the Tigrayans because they've got the kind of religious heartland, and even Eritreans who aren't Ethiopians because they think that they learned so much under Italian colonialism and are so sort of professionally superior that it's them. So I don't think that I've kind of invented something in terms of writing about the ethnic story in Ethiopia. And I don't think that in any African country I don't think it gets you anywhere to sort of pretend that the ethnic question isn't there, when in fact it really is there, and that going forward it has to be dealt with. What always amazes me is how potent it is, and how people just fall back on that. But I do very much agree with you that what you want in your leadership is a developmental obsession, and that's something that is just sort of fabulous in Ethiopia, and that's Melis's legacy, really. So on robots, I don't know, robots in an oil refinery, robots in a cement plant, I don't think are the same as robots in a garment factory. So, Ori, I hear what you're saying. But I don't think that the use of robots and AI is going to disrupt manufacturing production so quickly that there's no point in Africa getting into it. And Africa has vast numbers of low-level activities in metals, in plastics, and whatever to get through that will create millions and millions of jobs before the average African is thinking about working in an oil refinery. Anyway, I genuinely hope that you're wrong, because if you're not, I can't see any way that services is going to create the jobs that Africa needs, and the worst fears of European right-wingers will come to pass. So all the sort of boats float north And then, getting politicians to care about second cities. I mean, I think, as I indicated earlier, that in general, you need to have that sort of developmental mindset. You need to have a bit of a planning apparatus to start thinking about cities, first-tier cities, second-tier cities, and so on and so forth. And too many African countries still just don't have this set up. But demonstration effects are hugely important. It's not that we have to try and convert all 54 or 55. What we have to do is we have to get half a dozen African countries doing things well, and those lessons then will pass to other countries, as happened in Asia. I mean, today, Cambodia, I think, is shipping about 100 billion. Is it possible? I mean, tens of billions of dollars of garments a year, and I never thought anything would get done in Cambodia. But if you wait long enough, the flying geese thing proves to be correct. And the last question was about statistical systems. I think there's a lot of variation. The only thing really I'd say is that if a government is serious about development, it will be serious about data and statistics, and it will call in the usual suspects in terms of the international aid community who work in these areas and train in these areas, and it will just up its game.
Yeah. I mean, one of my sort of heuristics about government seriousness is the extent to which they cite their own data and analysis versus, talking about SDGs and citing, World Bank research. It tells you to the extent to which they're doing their own homework in their own context. I would like to sort of reinforce this point about learning and sort of the power of demonstration effect. I think many of us in the room, want to see good things happen everywhere all the time, as quickly as possible. But I think there's value in sort of internalizing what Joe is suggesting here, which is that, we should try and get things done well, even if in a few places to begin with, so that we can say, look, we've succeeded here, and here are the lessons that we can use to take elsewhere. Because I think too often we rush to scale and fail almost everywhere, and therefore not have, the lessons that we can use for other contexts. I know we run out of time, but I think this was a useful discussion, and I once again highly recommend the book. My favorite bit were the 4 case studies. I think it's refreshing to read about success stories in difficult contexts, because that's how growth happens, right? You don't have to be perfect to grow. You grow to become better and continue, towards perfection. So thank you, Joe, for the book, and congratulations again on getting it done.
Esteemed speakers, please remain on the stage for the group photo.